What I'm going to be covering today is one of the most exciting features in the new Ableton Live 11 release that happened in February, and that's MIDI Polyphonic Expression, or MPE. It's kind of the most exciting thing to happen in MIDI since 1983, because I think it's the only thing that's happened with MIDI since 1983. So we can fairly grade it quite highly. But it's actually super cool. What it does is it takes a lot of the inspiration from natural acoustic playing, where by moving your fingers slightly or making slight gesture changes in your body, you can actually affect the timbre of the sound or the pitch of the sound. So a guitar is a really good example because you can bend a string with a slight gesture of a finger, or you can play closer to the bridge or closer to different pickups and things like that, and you get different sounds. So those are kind of subtle effects a lot of times brought into the control that you get with MIDI. Can be very dramatic or it can be very subtle. So you can make it as natural or as dramatic as you want it to be. So let me just give a quick example of what you can do with MPE, and then I'll explain what I'm doing. This is using the Wavetable synthesizer in Ableton Live, which is set up quite nicely to work with MPE. So what I've been able to do with this is each finger is transmitting on its own MIDI channel. So I have independent pitch bend and independent control over the timbre of each note. So I play a chord and I can get different sounds and bring out different parts of that chord simply by moving up and down on the keyboard. I can also pitch bend and introduce vibrato in the same way that you might with a violin. And then, of course, I can take that pitch bend and just sort of glissando into different chords. So I can go from a major to minor and other formations. My music theory is not that tight, so I'm not going to name all those fancy things. The other thing it gives you is after pressure per finger, so I can map that to whatever I want in the synthesizer, and in this case I'm really kind of peaking out the resonance of the filter. So that is an example of how you can use MPE. You can play it straight, or you can do these sort of, I was doing a long sustained chord and giving you the example of how you can manage all of that timbre. You can play it straight and staccato too. So you can see just by playing in different areas, I get a lot of variation on that each individual note. So it kind of takes a preset for a synthesizer and expands its capabilities and potentials. This is really great from a player perspective. From a preset designer, it can be a little bit challenging because you can't really fix how the person's going to be using it or what their expectations are. The other cool thing about MPE is you see it a lot of times demonstrated with a keyboard because that's kind of like the default interface for music. And in my case, I have to say that's somewhat unfortunate. So with the Morph, you can actually choose your interface by swapping things out. This is the Booklet Thunder interface, which was developed by Don Booklet as a way to sort of find different ways of expressing yourself through electronic instruments. And the cool thing about this for MPE is that it really works out well to get that slide on each individual note. It gives you a little bit more freedom than the piano, which has different slide links for each note. And then the mappings of the notes are a little bit more arbitrary. In this case, it's set to go ascend towards the center. And then we have bass in the center. So this can be used for very wild sound design, cinematic type things, but it can also have very practical effects, and I'll show you some of those. First, let's take a look at how we set this stuff up in Ableton Live. There's some nuts and bolts things that occur with sort of every MPE implementation. So I'm going to switch over to a screen view, and I'm going to have to double check that I actually have these things figured out here. There we go. So now you enter the great feedback void there. So now we're looking at Ableton Live, and we can take a look at that instrument that I was working with here in Live. So I have a Wavetable synthesizer, and then I have some, of course, some compression and effects. The important thing to note about Wavetable is that really all of your MPE mappings are done in this matrix. And unfortunately in Live, we don't really have a standard interface for MPE for every single instrument. And in fact, you get two instruments for the most part to really dive into MPE control with, the sampler and Wavetable. The other ones do not have MPE capabilities. There are things you can do to sort of make those things happen. If you're really curious about a lot of the ins and outs, you can go to a website we set up. And that is at mpe.design. And this simple website kind of gives you the overview of what MPE is, and gives you a starter pack, and then kind of gives you the overview of each instrument and how you might use MIDI Polyphonic Expression in each one. It also goes over some of the special devices that are in Live, and I'll show you some of those too. And those give you some control over MIDI Polyphonic Expression. So let's take a look at what we did here with Wavetable. I can actually start with, I'm going to go ahead and start with a new instance of Wavetable. And I will go to Instruments, Wavetable. And before I start this, I'm going to take a quick look at my computer behind me. And it sounds like there's some people maybe asking some questions, so I'll be back. And I'm coming over here, and let's see. Question about Reason, if you can take integration with the rack or the VST plugins. That is a good question. Probably, the Reason itself does not work with MPE, so it's kind of the last big DAW. There's two big DAWs, Pro Tools and Reason, that do not deal with MPE really at all. And so those, you would have to do some fakery and trickery. You can still take advantage of all of the pressure and the sliding and things, but you can't do it polyphonic per finger. And that's probably something best addressed in a different tutorial, but that is a sort of quick response to that question from Rick. Thank you for that. Anyway, back to Wavetable in Live. When you drop in just a basic instance, a default instance from the browser in Live, it will actually have MPE controls, so you can try some things out. So it's responding to the pitch, it's responding to pressure, and it's responding to my gestures up and down. And when I go to the Mpe tab in Wavetable, which is new for 11, it gives us a matrix very similar. If you're already familiar with this, it's really the same sort of thing as the MIDI tab in Wavetable. And you can see how note pitch bend, and that's different from pitch bend. This is the Mpe version of it. It's per note. It's set to 48. So that's going to dictate sort of how the sensitivity of the pitch bend. So when it's set to 48 and everything is sort of loaded up with the Sensel Morph script and everything, you can just bend an octave. And if I turn that off, and this is something I do a lot of times when I'm designing MPE instruments, then it doesn't respond to that pitch. I'll do that because sometimes I just want to make sure things are always in tune, and I want to be able to play them flawlessly. For the slide gesture, you can see this is affecting the position. So if we look at the animation of the oscillator, it just follows what I'm doing with my finger. And then the pressure is going to the warp parameter. So you'll see the oscillator warp a little bit. I'll go ahead and bump that up so it's very dramatic, and you'll be able to see it perhaps better. And to hear it better. So in some ways it's not so musical, but maybe quite fun to play with. If you want to add more features to your MPE control, for example, the filter, you can do that, but it may not be immediately obvious because you don't see that in the matrix here. All you have to do is go ahead and move a knob on a feature such as resonance or frequency, and then it gives you that line in the matrix, and then you can go ahead and apply that to something. So instead of slide going to the position, I'll have that impact the filter. And then the other thing is I need to do is create an offset. So now once I have this offset here, that sort of represents my bottom value. And then I can control the filter frequency. And you'll notice that my shape is not changing anymore with that. I would have to manually set that. Of course, things get interesting because you can start applying various amounts of all of these things to different parameters and introduce another oscillator, et cetera, and then you arrive at something like I did in this wavetable, where I'm actually controlling 2 oscillators, and you can see my MPE matrix is a little bit more built out here. So that's kind of a strictly electronic example with the. That's really sorry, trying to control things here. Hi, there I am. That's really kind of an electronic example using Wavetable, and you can do things that are perhaps maybe just a little bit more of a way to augment things rather than create something far out. So in this other example, I'm going to take one of the built-in instruments. Spitfire produced a number of orchestral and string instruments for the new Live 11 release. They have a lot of really great sounds, and they have MPE versions of them, so you have some control over the expressiveness. These things, they're pretty cool. They're probably exactly what a composer for soundtracks needs, but when I look at it from sort of a I always kind of want things a little bit more dramatic and expressive and experimental for my music and my MPE instruments. So I'll show you what I did with one of their instruments just by stacking a couple things and adjusting some of the MPE parameters. So let's switch over to the screen view again. And this is, I'm going to go ahead and sort of just play the initial one. This is in the PAX, I believe it's the Brass Quartet. So if we go to the Brass Quartet instruments, you'll find the MPE Brass Quartet. And these all have some subtle MPE controls. This one is just sort of a staccato. Staccato trumpet. So there's not a lot of opportunity to use the glide or the aftertouch, which is fine. But you can actually use the glide for changing the sort of, you can change sort of the timbre of that staccato burst. And in this case, I just add a mixed reverb. Now that is kind of an interesting idea. Unfortunately, you can't do these per finger, so. It really dominates globally because reverb can't be done per finger without a lot of crazy patching. So what I did is I have the a special instrument or special device, I should say, in this chain. So I have added the expression control, and that's found in the MIDI effects, and you'll find expression control, and that allows you to pull out the data or the messages coming from your MIDI controller and apply them to individual parameters quite easily. And in this case, I take the slide MPE parameter and then use the mapping to the dry wet of the reverb, which is downstream from that. And now I can do that really kind of simple effect with the staccato. And then I really kind of wanted to be able to have the option to sustain something. And that's where the after pressure comes in and creating another chain in the instrument rack. So I dragged one of the instruments from that pack, the sustaining brass instruments, and made it so that it responds to the after pressure. So I'm going to go ahead and take that off of mute, and now we'll hear what that sounds like. So I can still play it the staccato way. But then I have that sustain from the other instrument that is in the layer that is all controlled by the pressure. And that is done in the sampler. A lot of these things are going to be delivered as simplers. And so when you use a simpler instrument, you are going to have to, I'll go ahead and just give you a demonstration of that. Why not? You'll need to pull them apart a little bit. So if we just take one of their MPE instruments, I believe these are all delivered as simplers, which will respond to MPE, but as they're delivered, you can't actually edit them. So if we take a look at the chain here, we will eventually find somewhere in there a simpler. Oh, this is actually a sampler, so that was not a good example. Let's take something else, maybe. We can just go to Instruments, Simpler, Ambient and Evolving, and I'll just take something from here. Just so you know that you can right-click on this and turn it into a sampler, and then you will have control over MIDI, MPE. And that's done in the MIDI tab with the note pitch bend slide and after pressure. And then here you just select what parameter you want to map to in the same way that you would use mod wheel, but you just have several more mod wheels. You have up to 15 because you have 15 different channels per finger that you can deal with. So going back here, we take a look at what I did on the sustain. Let's see, I added really the sustain to there's 4 layers in this instrument. I really didn't want to modify each one. I just selected the one that was actually really responsible for the sustain. And I added some shaper, which is, I actually had to just go ahead and turn this on and add a selection and add an amount. Now, this is kind of weird because it's another quirk of the implementation in live. This is the amount, the maximum amount of the shaper. So if you apply this to slide, this is 0, and then it goes up to a ceiling of 42. So you can hear that it's really kind of blowing things out when I do that. And that's actually kind of a nice effect because it adds a little bit of growl to that acoustic instrument. And then I have the pressure going to the volume. So that way I can do sort of these interesting things with kind of like modulating a chord. And you can really add a lot of texture that way just by moving around on your fingers on the keyboard and giving it some beating with the pitch as well as the pressure, changing the volume of each note. And then that really actually kind of delivers some really nice effects if you throw a reverb on it, for example. kind of washes out those differences a little bit. And then I also have an LFO that I've added to slide, and I can change the rate. And that LFO is affecting pan. So you can really patch these things out however advanced or as simple as you want. The cool thing is you can only you can make those you can almost patch those things live with your fingers. And that is what's really exciting about MPE. Let's take a look at some other things. So we've actually released a couple packs recently, the Analog Essentials and Tectonics packs. So we have, if you go to Sensel.com, and oops, sorry, wrong one. We have a few packs here. I'm going to just go this way, Tectonics and Analog Essentials. These are both very reasonably priced packs of MPE content that give you a lot of interesting sounds and interesting mappings. So in this case, I have this Booklet sample. And Tectonics is an MPE pack for live and for Bitwig. It's really designed around a lot of sort of percussive, like sort of techno sounds, but kind of blows them out into the MPE world. Which leads me to sort of these ideas of MPE being for something more than just these sort of wild forays into timbre and texture. You can actually use them for sort of pragmatic purposes in a way. So if we listen to some of these kits from their Tectonics, what we've done here is we've actually sort of used one of the special devices, Mpe Control, which allows us to create response curves for our slide. So instead of slide being a smooth gesture, well, I'm on the wrong octave there. Instead of it being a smooth gesture here, which affects the timbre, it actually sort of just affects the timbre on that particular sample, essentially giving me two different pads or a variation on that pad. And for this kit, which is more like actual drums, there's kind of just a subtle shift in the kick in pulling down the attack. And that one just, you probably can't hear it on a stream, but this one just has like a much deeper low end. And here's another thing you can do, just like creating this ridge here at the top. That actually instantiates an arpeggiator. Or actually, I think it's a square wave LFO. So I've kind of doubled the number of pads here by using MPE, but rather than just having more samples, it's all relevant variations. And again, this just shifts the pitch up at the top here on this top edge. So this is influenced kind of by like real playing of an acoustic drum, where your edge has a different sound than the center. But rather than just being too subtle about it, I make it sort of a new variation. This one is just the reverse. And again, this is using just straight up MPE mappings on that particular sample. We can take a look at that going through to the MPE, the MIDI tab. We can see that I'm just doing a sample selection here. So I have two samples in here and use the selector and map that to MPE. And it plays a reverse one instead of the other one. So this is really like a simple example of using MPE in a pragmatic way. And then sort of for the final simple version of MPE, this is like a sort of a TB303 style bass, and this uses an arpeggiator. And again, I'm using MPE here as a way to sort of control the timbre on that and introduce some different resonances. So you can use it to control groove more than you would use it to control, so much like shifting timbres and textures. And so that's, again, just sort of like a way to take advantage of these things with a sort of more technical perspective on things. Let's see. Any questions here? So someone is asking if it works with an iPad. Yes, it does. The Bluetooth performance with MIDI Polyphonic Expression, I'm going to be straightforward and say it's not awesome. But it is also cool because you can hook up an iPad with a single cable. You don't need a powered hub. You actually can put this in a low-powered mode. So that actually makes it a lot easier to connect via USB, and pretty much USB is always better than Bluetooth anyway. So I'm not gonna worry about that too much. All right, so other thing I wanted to show is some other cool things about the Morph. And here's really a simple custom controller you can make. So this is the Innovator's overlay. And you can use this with the overlay where I have a piece of paper. So I'll go ahead and switch my view here. So this is just a piece of paper behind the Innovator's overlay. And you can see it's just a simple grid. And that is laid out just within our software in the Sensel app. And that's what you use if you want to modify any of the mappings on these things or load some of the maps we have for our Ableton and Bitwig scripts. This allows you to lay out your different areas, assign them notes, assign them, whether they're going to act as sliders or as MPE pads or as just regular notes. You can then just take that image and then bring it into your favorite image editing software and make it pretty. So for example, this particular one, I added labels and did all of that fine work in Adobe Illustrator. And then you print it out and everything's to scale. So let's try this out. This actually shows off some of the cool new firmware stuff too. I will go ahead and load. All right, that's pretty wild. So this kind of gives you like the Linstrument grid, if you will. It's just a small squares, and each one has its X, Y, and then pressure. But then the cool thing is with our latest firmware update, you can actually do some really cool pitch bend stuff. So you can actually pitch bend vertically. So that is a very unexpected use of that particular instrument, I would say. And this is really a simple thing to set up. You can actually make it work so that there's no overlay. There's a special mode for making sure that it loads whatever this mapping is. And actually, it's quite nice because it gives you this really smooth surface. So for some instances, that might be quite desirable. And let's see, so I have a little bit more time here. I mean, really, I have all day. So let me go through some of the more boring practical things in live about setting up MPE, and in particular using, like a Morph so everything works nicely. So I can, use these arrow keys to switch my tracks. I can use these as sends, things like that. And that's all done with this special script. In Live, I'm going to go ahead and switch to my view here so you can see the screen. And in the preferences, really all you need to do is, once you have the control surface implemented, you can get that from our website at guide.sensel.com. And go to the software setups. And you'll see all of our script documentation here and how to install it and everything. And here you just make sure you have to have the Mpe control ticked off in the preferences for the controller. And once you have that set up, then everything just kind of just works. When you want to use a plugin that is Mpe, you almost always have to configure the plugin itself. So if you grab, for example, Madrona Labs Alto, which is kind of like Yellow Pages first in the list at all times. You need to go to its settings and go to Mpe, and then now it's going to react to the Mpe modulations, and then you can take, for example, the Y and map it to the timbre of the oscillator. And the thing is, like, we have a lot of documentation about this on our YouTube channel. Oh, I think I've lost my overhead camera. That's a drag. Let me go ahead and switch my battery out. Such are the dangers of going live and having batteries that are not adequate. Okay. And let's zoom back in. I wonder if that's what the person was asking a question about. Let's go ahead and see what the question is here. Sander, wondering when your product will be available in the EU mainland stores. Actually, they're auto overlays all the time. We will talk to our distributor about that. It is available through Thomann, which I know is one of the more popular mainland EU stores, and Just Music, I believe, is also serviced. If you go to our website, you can see there's a where to buy section. So we actually list several different retailers that will sell the Morph and the overlays. So let's going back to live. Yeah, so I was saying that the plugins, you kind of need to just add the protocol, and if you go to our YouTube channel, you'll see that there's lots of different software that we document, like Pigments, Serum, and let's see, all the audio damage products, Alto, several others, and this is a series that we kind of do regularly anyway. We try to get a lot of information about how do you set up Mpe and all these different plug-in systems. We also have information about using other DAWs like Bitwig and Presonus and Cubase, and how you use Mpe in those different instruments. Yeah, beyond that's sort of the nuts and bolts of using it. And let's see if there's any other questions out there. I'd be happy to take them. If not, I think it's probably a good time to wrap up, as that we are now at the half-hour mark. Let me see if there's any questions, and if not, then I will bid you all a good day, and thanks for joining us, and I hope it was quite informative. Yeah, so this guy asks, will macros MIDI mapped to a surface of Sensel stay mapped to that overlay once you switch out surfaces? Yes, they will. So in this case, I'm using the script, so this is probably the most germane, but these are all auto-mapped to any macros you have set up. So if I group this and we take a look at our macro knobs, we can see that those knobs are turning when I turn this. If you MIDI map them, then yes, it will, because you would have this mapped to, you know, whatever channel 1 MIDI controller 15 or something like that. So let's say I want to hard map that to a specific macro. I will go ahead and do that. So now that's mapped to channel 1 CC9. And we can exit MIDI mapping and we can see that we're controlling that. If we take this off and go to the piano and play our beautiful patch there, put this back here, and then we're back to controlling that macro again with the MIDI learn. And just to sort of prove that out, I can go to another device here, and we can see that this does not work anymore because we've MIDI mapped that and taken it over with the user control. And so yes, to answer that question. Also with macros and our overlays in the script, you can see I have the control surface script loaded here, Sensel Morph MPE. So these actually will control the macros, sorry. This will control, you can see on my macros that my pressure is affecting macro 3, and the X and Y is affecting macros 1 and 2. And similarly, this is 4, 5, and 6 on pressure. So these are really things that you would want to design for in your instrument rather than just apply them to any old, you know, macro setup. But once you do set up your macros to work with these can be quite enchanting because you can control like delay times and mix and sends and things like that. So you can really kind of inject your sound with new timbres by working with these and playing the knobs themselves, playing the slides themselves. And one more trip to the question queue. Yes, this guy, you are welcome for the answer. That is why we live stream, so you can get those answers immediately. All right, well, thank you so much for joining us here. I hope you enjoy the rest of Synthesesia. We have a special, get a free overlay or a free case when you buy a Morph. Just head on over to our landing page. You can get it from the controller section of Synthesesia. And the coupon's good for a few more days. So if you're not ready to buy today, you can get that offer in a few more. We're also available at a lot of retailers, particularly in Australia and the US and the European markets. We have good representation in those areas. Otherwise, you can buy online at morph.sensel.com. And of course, B&H Photo, who I recently learned is also sponsoring the Synthesesia event. They carry the Sensel Morph as well. And so they're a really great retailer to work with because they know what they're doing. All right. Thanks so much for joining us, and have a wonderful rest of your weekend. Take care.